they may come to you and say, I want you to trace this tissue. Here's a medical record number. Show me the PO you received it on and who checked it in at the loading dock. They may do the opposite and say, tell me how this was distributed here and how you verified that when it came in, it was delivered on dry ice in an acceptable package with acceptable temperature range. Those are all things that the hospital now has to be able to produce, and they simply weren't able to back in, as Gary said, the day.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Jesse Liebler, VP of Strategic Accounts at TrackCore. We're wrapping up this season of Power Supply. We're going to be talking about tissue tracking today. It's evolved from the days when Gary was a spine rep filling out paper and trying to track this. It was on the company's kind of responsibility, but now there's mutual accountability, there's regulation, and we can leverage technology. We're going to get some best practices for supply chain and all of that today in our conversation with Jesse, Gary. And yeah, it's going to be giving you the flashbacks, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. I'm looking forward to seeing where this is taken off from the Flintstones to, now we're on Mars. So things have evolved a ton, and I think the software application, I'm really excited to see where he takes it. I know we could probably talk about it for additional episodes moving forward. So looking forward to see where we're at on this tissue tracking episode with Power Supply.
All right, wrapping up this season with Jesse Liebler up next.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Jesse Liebler, VP of Strategic Accounts at TrackCore. We are going to be talking about tissue tracking today. Joining us on the Power Supply podcast, Jesse, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So it's amazing. Gary, I want to say we're in our 4th year. We had one really cool episode with Randy Subramani over at New York Presbyterian, and we were talking about like sourcing leeches and other unique products into the healthcare supply chain. We talked about some themes that are going to come up today with chain of custody and obviously tissues. But what's interesting is I can't believe we made it this far and never had a conversation around tissue tracking. So Jesse's going to break the ice for our audience and get this covered today. Jesse, thanks so much for coming on and maybe tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I've been with TrackCore for 11 years, serving in the role currently in the VP of Strategic Accounts for the better part of 6 years. I've done everything from training implementation to account management and sales. And really my role here at the company is to help inform our clients of all of the different solutions that we provide, as well as to serve as a subject matter expert for our tissue tracking policies, how our applications serve the industry in that space, as well as really anything that relates to the world of implant management and healthcare. So I'm well versed in the topic we're going to talk about today and have been living it for the last several years.
Well, I know we're going to give some background and some history. Gary, how much do you know about tissue tracking? I'm just sort of curious.
Well, I was a spine rep, and then I was in that world. So we kind of dealt with that and how it had to be delivered to the OR. I guess if we're talking about the same tissue. And I think we're going to define, I'm going to ask the question for the people listening on the podcast is what is when we say tissue tracking. So Jesse, I want to give a little speed on that. But also when I was working back in the day, we mandated that in the OR too with a lot of our contracts. So curious, Jesse, when you talk about tissue tracking, give us the overall 30,000, what that looks like so our end users know where we're going on this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. So a lot of folks would think of the term tissue and immediately think that it's, human derived tissue, right? And so the industry actually has multiple classifications for what could be considered quote unquote tissue product. The FDA has its own set of classifications. The Joint Commission has its own set of classifications. Certain other regulatory bodies have things that exclude certain products that they may find are combination product or a medical device in its true classification versus a tissue. So we actually have to really educate the market in helping understand what truly classifies a tissue and what regulatory agency that each hospital is accredited through would be required to satisfy those tracking regulations. For example, the FDA's classification really is around the human cellular-based products that are implantable, transplantable, or intended for transfer into a human. And even when we break that down, there are several different types of product or device classifications. You can have a true tissue that they classify as an HCTP, a human cellular transplantable product. And then you can also have medical devices. You can have combination products where it's a combination of human tissue and medical device. And so you really have to look at a granular level to figure out whether a product that's living on the shelf at the hospital is classified by the FDA as a tissue. And then you have to go beyond that to look at the other accrediting organizations to see what their regulations state. Another example would be the Joint Commission, right? Most of the healthcare organizations in America are accredited through Joint Commission, and they define human and non-human products that are cellular based as tissue. So as I look at the regulations, I may have a product that is human derived tissue. I may have a product that is porcine derived tissue, which means that it comes from pig skin and or other cellular based products from within the pig. So it's really a broad question, but there's a lot of research that has to go into finding that answer.
Yeah, I loved the choice of words living on the shelves. I think that if you didn't do that intentionally, you definitely should have. So history of tissue tracking, Gary was just talking about back in the day. And I'm kind of wondering what that tissue tracking looked like for you, Gary. And then maybe Jesse can tell us how that evolved or has evolved over time. And we're going to talk about maybe some scenarios that necessitated improvements in this area too.
Well, I think this is perfect, especially since Hayes isn't on, and we can say I'm not old as Hayes. It was born in the 1940s, but I probably in, the last 3 or 4 decades, and I'm quite younger than Hayes, so really miss him being here today. But I remember it coming in, and I remember there was a manual sheet, write it down, lot numbers, zero cold storage, whatever you want to call it, wherever it was on the shelf, living in whatever it was, whatever case it was going to be used for. But it was a trackable implant log, a lot of manual processes back in the day. And I know that's been some time. I mean, it's been a while. I mean, you had to there was regulatory and you had to document it in multiple areas. And, I think it went the patient chart as well. And I'm not going to get in that too much detail, but from a vendor perspective, you had to track it and you had to know where it was going, where it was coming from, and really follow into the patient. So obviously some regulatory requirements there, but that was the vendor side. And I know, Jesse, it's probably come a long way.
I was just going to ask. Yeah. So it started out as the vendors were self-policing, but obviously now there needs to be a lot more visibility on the hospital side, Jesse.
Yeah, so Justin, from my experience and working in the industry, there's a story that I always like to share that really sets the stage for why some of these regulations kind of came to the forefront and why the priority has been given to the tissue tracking workflow. Gary described the original process very well. Manual logbooks, a lot of nursing documentation and sticker sheets and rep involvement in the process. But nowadays, most hospitals are looking to, standardize that with an electronic platform, and there's a good reason for it. One of the stories that I always like to share is back in around 2008, there was an organization that was founded by a former dentist in the state of New Jersey. And he had created a tissue distribution organization that was illegally harvesting cadaver bodies from morgues, from university hospitals that utilized those cadavers for different reasons. And in doing that, he had created kind of this black market opportunity to redistribute biologic tissue to hospitals, package them, put them in a nice container, and ship them out. And the hospital, due to their lack of traceability of those tissues, was really unable to satisfy any type of bidirectional traceability, any type of look back when there was a nationwide recall issued for that company. So we found that there was somewhere around 30,000 tissues distributed by that company alone, of which more than 10,000 were actually implanted to a patient. And of that 10,000, roughly 10% were not able to be found when that nationwide recall went into effect. So you're talking about 1,000 tissues, 1,000 patients potentially that were affected by this, and no ability to trace the tissue to the patient. So that time period really kind of shed light on the issue that these manual logbooks and the lack of consistency caused. What happened is the Joint Commission, along with other regulatory agencies, they stopped really treating it like a checkbox in their site audits. They started really scrutinizing what that tissue policy was at the hospital level. So now you've got an operating room that is, not able to just show a logbook and say, here's how we track our tissues, and the auditor or the surveyor sign off on it. Now they're really forcing them to go through the process, start to finish. Where does this tissue come in from the loading dock? Show me how you're registering it from that area all the way through to how that documentation connects to the next person in line and that chain of custody. Where does that live in the operating room? Where does it get stored in the operating room? Show me the temperature logs for the storage area in the operating room. Show me who removed it from that freezer and took it to the patient and got it prepared and issued it to the patient. And so you can start to see all of these different chain of custody events that are very much required and have been required for quite a long time, but they're out in front of that surveyor or that auditor and being a focus point for their visit to the hospital.
Mm. So obviously a whole lot more standards, requirements, regulation. Is that why the hospital obviously started to take on more ownership? Is like they had to report on it. I mean, it's very simple, right? They can't just say it's being done. Now they're getting surveyors that are asking detailed questions. Not only is it being done, but how is it being done? Is that the essence of it?
I think that's a great way to put it. And Gary made a great point earlier. A lot of the hospitals that are having these products and these regulations that are affected by these products stored at their campuses, a lot of them didn't know what some of these regulations were. They didn't even know how to properly classify what's a tissue. And so they're looking out on the shelf and they might see a product that says biocompatible, and they see that prefix bio and think automatically that's a tissue. That's not always true. It could be a combination product, a medical device. It may not require this level of tracking, but understanding what those tissue and biologic components are, understanding what products align with the regulations, and then, yes, having the responsibility now on your shoulders to go back and be able to trace it bidirectionally from start to finish, with any piece of information that the surveyor may bring up to you. They may come to you and say, I want you to trace this tissue. Here's a medical record number. Show me the PO you received it on and who checked it in at the loading dock. They may do the opposite and say, tell me how this was distributed here and how you verified that when it came in, it was delivered on dry ice in an acceptable package with acceptable temperature range. Those are all things that the hospital now has to be able to produce, and they simply weren't able to back in, as Gary said, the day.
Yeah. So
sounds like some supply chain expertise could be useful here. Oh, sorry, Gary. I stole your
Justin,
commentary.
you're rolling. We're hey, this is called ESPN. It's back and forth between our brains, so I really like it. I was just going to say the same thing. Supply chain involvement. Where is that evolving, Justin? Your point's because I remember sitting in some of these Joint Commission mock surveys or the real Joint Commission. Give us the question. You got an hour to find it. From proof of the delivery dock, and it was zero cold storage, however we're going to define that, to how it gets to implantable and that trackable piece. Because I think we're in a room. The Joint Commission is here, and you get asked that question, where does it start, Jesse? Does it go straight to supply chain? Does it go straight to the CNO? Does it go straight to quality, risk? Who does it go to? And how do we ensure that supply chain is in the middle of this too as well? Because they're a key component.
Yeah, and you made a good point there, Gary, that it's not one department, it's not one entity at the hospital that's responsible. Yes, the policies dictate that you have to have a standard policy and procedure written for tissue tracking, but that policy and procedure usually spans across multiple departments, and supply chain inevitably ends up being at the forefront of it because of the fact that we have to start at the initial point of entry and follow that chain of custody all the way through. So we're talking about shipping and receiving. We're talking about the storage locations inside of the OR and the ability for biomed to be involved in tracking of the temperature and the alarms that are set up with those freezers that are storing those products. There's regulations tied into almost every area of those different workflows that really force supply chain to see it holistically from start to finish and be involved in it from start to finish. Even at the end of the day, when the nursing staff are required to kind of fill out the documentation and assign that product to the patient in the medical record, supply chain still ends up at the end of the day needing to reconcile that and make sure that that product, is no longer part of either their active PAR or their specialty order, and they need that communication delivered. So there's just a lot of information now that supply chain has to take responsibility for, whereas I think, in previous state, there was a lot of clinical documentation, a lot of reps involved in those documentation steps.
Pretty obvious opportunity for technology and some sort of tracking software. Obviously here, you can't do this by paper and be able to give that kind of visibility on any kind of time frame in any kind of realistic fashion. We talked about the regulatory requirements and the industry guidelines pretty good right there. But I want to walk through the chain of custody because you alluded to it, like shipping and receiving. But then there's also permanent storage when it lives on the shelf. And then you introduced me to something called product issuance, which we'll get into, as well as maybe some timing considerations there. But let's go with shipping and receiving. Obviously basic core kind of supply chain function in terms of logistics here. But when does that transfer the chain of custody? Who's responsible from the vendor, or I should say, to what point is the vendor responsible, and when does the hospital take over accountability? And even how do you make sure that the product remains viable during that time, since it is a tissue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, the hospital is responsible anytime that they accept a tissue. Joint Commission, for one, specifically states you must document dates, times, staff involved anytime a tissue is accepted, prepared, or issued. And there's that issued word again we'll get into. When we think of accepting a tissue, we start from the loading dock, from the initial point of entry to the hospital, accepting responsibility for that package and for that inventory, and then having the responsibility to continue documenting the chain of custody from there. So the responsibility from the manufacturer or the distributor of that tissue is really from the FDA's guidelines to make sure that it's transported or couriered to the hospital using approved storage containers, things like dry ice, proper packaging on there that says this product is fine if received by this time undamaged. The dry ice inside is going to keep that product at a relative temperature, and it's an FDA-approved shipping container from that tissue distribution center. Those are things that the FDA has regulations for the distributor and for the manufacturers, and then upon acceptance at the hospital, everything really falls on the hospital from a chain of custody perspective.
Jesse, I was just going to think about a question. We had a shortage of freezers for a while, didn't we? We had a big, giant issue. Did that affect the tissue world bigger than a big deal back then when COVID hit and all the freezers everybody was trying to grab?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about cold chain units, it's imperative that these products are able to be stored, maintained, and they require daily and hourly temperature monitoring or recording. So you're not only required to have that product stored within a temperature that's sustainable for it, but you actually have to be able to prove that there is an hourly recording of temperature that can be then reported back for all of those cold chain units where frozen tissue and other implantables are stored. And then, again, the monitoring of it, that's where it comes back to like a biomed or engineering team where a lot of them are using, that technology to alarm if it goes out of range or anything else. So think of a scenario where you're trying to provide an Achilles tendon to an athlete or to a patient that needs it. You're now having to schedule that, the logistics nightmare of it being delivered day of so that it's within that shipping container with 72 hours worth of dry ice. I mean, you don't have a lot of flexibility there. And these aren't products you can just take and go throw back on the shelf, right? I mean, that's a living tissue that was provided from an organ donor or a cadaver body that's very valuable, and we need to treat it as such.
And Jesse, you made a really good point. It comes back to our first comment on what is tissue. It could be anything from a donor to an Achilles tendon to could be heart, could be porcine. I mean, we're talking about all these different entities, and everything's expensive in supply chain, but these I'm sure are very expensive. And if you don't maintain them and say you have a freezer go out and it's not being checked on a monthly basis or on an hourly basis, and those checks that the freezer's still working, it's very costly, correct?
Exactly. It can be extremely costly. I mean, implants in general make up the majority of the OR spend. So when you think about the specialty implants like tissue, especially ones where you're ordering, for a lot of procedures just in time, there's added shipping costs with those. There's pretty much zero return possibility. It's very strict in how that logistics workflow needs to occur.
And one follow-up question, because you just said just in time, and I haven't heard just in time, not like just in pooling, but just in time inventory. I mean, this is a big deal. Like, we're going into par levels now. Like, how are we par levels got to be a big issue. How are your inventory controls? Because space in freezers are limited. On the shelf is limited. Like, NER is limited. Like, these are coming in, coming out. They're not sitting on they don't have shelf lives that are very, very long, correct? Walk us through that a little bit on the par levels, please. Inventory control, the supply chain side.
Yeah, good points. Definitely a shorter shelf life for a lot of these products than most. Ironically, there is a big push to get a lot more product in ambient temperature, which means it's uncontrolled and it does not carry as much of a burden when it comes to the cold chain type storage. So those end up with a little bit longer shelf life and would be, on the shelf like many other products. But for those fresh frozen allograft tissues and things that we have to store in the freezer, a lot of those are specialty order. We don't end up seeing our hospital partners utilize par levels for those. And many times you're ordering specific sizes, and those sizes may not even be available. If I have a 6'5" patient come in versus a 5'2" patient, I can't utilize the same type of tendon. There are differences in how those products have to get ordered simply from that regard. So it's definitely possible for us to have some of these items starting to transfer out and start to live on a par. But the majority, I would say, are still specialty orders that come in just in time or in short order prior to procedures.
Yeah, I want to come back to this and those best practices around PAR management and specialty orders. And I know you covered a lot of it, but I do want to wrap up that product issuance because we teased it. And I think it kind of comes into play here a little bit in that chain of custody. And I want to put a bow on that, come back to best practices, and then we can kind of talk about technology as we wrap up. But what is like product issuance? How do you define that? What does it mean? How should health systems be looking at that? And then maybe tie it back into the best practices around PAR and specialty items and maybe even other considerations.
Yeah, another great question, Justin. We always attribute issuance to basically any time that a product is moved from one responsible party to another. And party could be a human party, it could be a storage location, it could be a department. And so the regulations don't truly define what they mean by issuance. They state, again, we need to know dates, times, and staff involved when tissue is accepted, prepared, and issued. So we take the more general approach to say, well, if I am issuing it from a freezer to a nurse who's going to take it then to the operating room and then provide it to a patient, there's multiple issuance steps there. I'm issuing it from a controlled storage environment to a person, the person to a room, and the room then to a patient. So we would expect to document all of those steps within the workflow to properly showcase chain of custody and satisfy the Joint Commission's need for bidirectional traceability. When we think about issuance to a patient, a lot of times that's simply documenting the item inside of the medical record, right? And our nursing staff are trying to get to a point where they can scan those items into the medical record and have all of the data, the serial number, the expiration date, the product information accurately charted there. So that way we know that was issued to that patient and that patient now has that living in their bodies. But the way that issuance has always been documented historically is very less intense than the steps I'm describing. It's here at the hospital, now it's to the patient, and we don't get a lot of the in-between.
Yeah, which limits you on process improvement, right? If there's ever a failure in the system, how would you identify where you need to target your corrective action? Is that kind of why you take that approach?
Yeah, you hit on timing earlier, so I'll circle back to that. If I take a fresh frozen allograft tissue out of a freezer, where am I documenting how long and where it was, or if I put it in a transport container on dry ice for the 2 hours that the procedure was going on before I actually put it in the patient's knee or, wherever that may be going. So there's a lot of steps there and a lot of data there that needs to be documented somewhere in some way, and we can't just start and finish with storage patient. There's a lot in between.
It's pretty clear from the beginning, like I said earlier, the automated nature and needing a technology to do the tracking, but I can also see that, tracking exactly what is a big part of that question. And there was something else that you just said, and I think you kind of outlined that really well. Like if you can track all those stages, then you have better data to be able to make better decisions when there's clear need for improvement. But then you also mentioned something about determining when it was issued to the patient, and there's obviously billing considerations there. So it's not simply tracking, right? Like, are there integrations that come into play here that not only help track all those various stages, but also from a billing perspective to be able to look at the finances of the equation?
I think charge capture is a big point, Justin. I think you're right on.
Yeah, and charge capture obviously is a huge factor. It's the ability for software and other technology to prevent the lost charges, right? So that we know where the product is at all times, and we also enable the nursing staff to document as quickly and efficiently and accurately in their medical record as possible. Because in the old days of just peeling a sticker off and putting all of the information on a log sheet, that information does not relate to a direct charge inside of a system like an Epic or a Cerner or an electronic medical record. And so now with technology that we can take a barcode scanner, a handheld, a USB connected scanner, and just zap in the product information right from the manufacturer's barcode and populate it into the patient chart, which then can be tied directly on a one-to-one basis with the patient charge values. That is where the technology is helping with that. And then there's also, the use of RFID technology that we haven't really hit on yet, but being able to know when that product was removed from a storage location automatically and who took it. So that way, if Nurse Jesse walks away with a product and it never ends up in the patient record, but it also never goes back to storage, we at least have some accountability for where it was at an exact point in time, and we can trace that back to where that nurse was, where they were where they were working with a patient, which procedure room, etc.
Well, as a nurse, I can tell you that a lot of times we don't want to be spending time documenting. So anything that can automate elements of that record keeping is going to be seen positively. There's no doubt. I also, want to talk about bill only. How much, so we kind of come back to some best practices and leveraging technology in general to kind of tie this interview up in a bow. I'm assuming with some of these, with the tissues that, it's encompassing some of that elusive bill only PO process and data that's, kind of a constant struggle for hospitals. How much of the tissue tracking falls into that bill only PO game and chase?
Yeah, I would say that the majority of the bill only space is predicated around the medical devices. It's the non-biologics, it's the implants that are medical devices. But Gary brought up his time served in the spine industry, earlier, right? That's a very common one where I'm sure Gary's brought in, the Pelican briefcase with all the different sizes. And when we open that up and we look inside, it's kind of a physician buffet. We say, what do you need? And they take what they need. They pull it into the procedure. They use it. And the hardest part from a bill only perspective or to bridge the compliance gap there is whose responsibility is that? Have we actually taken acceptance of those products because they're in the hospital? Or have we only taken acceptance of them and responsibility when they're physically opened to the field and issued to the patient? And so we've always struggled with that, even in the software space, of how do we approach that? How do we make that process simpler? And the realistic opportunity there is utilize bill-only technology, utilize software, and have that workflow kind of coincide together. Have the bill-only request have a compliance aspect to it that we now see. Gary brought this product in for surgery today. We didn't know about it until the moment it was used, so we are still documenting our full chain of custody. But then from there, let's document the issuance to the patient, document everything we need in the medical record, and then follow up with Gary on the back end to get those products procured, after the fact.
So the technology, how you're leveraging it is sort of similar, but different use cases from the standpoint of, the chain of custody is so well defined on tissue that you really don't wind up with any bill only POs because that issuance is being tracked upon receipt at the facility. Whereas you've got this trunk stock that is hard to track that doesn't necessarily get received. It winds up into the OR. And so maybe you don't have the same regulations that are driving the management of that. The finance side says we'd like to have a much clearer picture on this. And the technology works in such a similar way that it's an obvious, broader application for a similar platform. Is that kind of how you're laying that out? Do I have that right?
Yeah, for the most part, I would say that the hospital's policy around tissue tracking is probably going to defer the bill-only process for tissues. Not to say that it's not going to happen, and it happens in pretty much every facility I've ever worked in where those products are going to come in. They're going to be used in that workflow, but they really need to be tied in with the full chain of custody, and there needs to be documentation no different than that product that was delivered in a week and a half ago, through FedEx at your loading dock. It's just, where does that process start? And then is there more we can do to further that process and, satisfy the needs that the rep has on the back end?
And I think just to add on to this too, Jesse and Justin, is is the contracting piece, the sourcing contracting piece. I think about all the appendices that come with this agreement with a tissue vendor, period. It's going to have the appropriate chain of custodies. It's going to have the inventory laws. It's going to be in compliance. It's going to be part of their KPIs, if you will, in really sourcing and contracting with that appropriate vendor. And it's got to be consistent, because I know if I'm answering to the CNO, I'm answering to the CFO, I'm answering to the CEO, whoever it is, we need to be consistent across the board on whatever those tissue vendors might be.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Jesse. Well, this has been a great interview, and thanks for keeping up with me and Gary as we're kind of, just walking through the thought process here. We haven't had this conversation on power supply before. You have been an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I love the detail and the orientation to process that you're really laying out in your discussion around this. And obviously the drivers are regulatory, but honestly, best practices and just having a smooth flow to your supply chain and that chain of custody is what is ideal for any health system. Anything you want to add before we wrap up?
I think really the biggest thing that I would add is that, when we talk about tissue tracking, most hospitals, most staff within supply chain or clinical positions, they really have kind of a micro focus around what that is. Again, we've talked about tissue versus xenografts and non-human tissue and how to classify things and really where the chain of custody needs to start and who manages it. We've talked about a lot of things there, but at the end of the day, tissue tracking has somewhat evolved into more just implant management. It's similar regulations for medical devices, heart valves that are mechanical, cochlear implants, different things that are out there nowadays with the advancements in medical technology that have allowed the hospital to take on, or I guess not allowed, but have burdened the hospital with even more responsibility now. So there's just a very similar path when it comes to tracking all implants. Gary brought up the bill-only process, and we talked about that. The bill-onlys, the medical devices, the implants, even explants. There's an entire set of regulations that we could go another hour on about explants and warranty credits for devices after we've implanted them and brought them back out of the patient. So those are all things that go more now into a holistic need for a solution that can manage the implant life cycle across the board for all different implant types and satisfy all of those different regulations.
All right, Jesse, great job once again. And for anybody who wants to think a little bit more about explanting and the ramifications of that, I highly recommend a movie. It's a documentary called The Bleeding Edge on Netflix. I'm going to go ahead and make that plug right now. Jesse Liebler, everybody. That was Jesse Liebler, VP of Strategic Accounts at TrackCore, and Gary talking about tissue tracking for the first time on the Power Supply podcast. Jesse's a wealth of information. I thought it was great how he kind of laid down the impetus for regulation, best practices, more oversight. Pretty crazy story about the dentist. Thousands of patients just kind of throwing out, tissue that seriously should obviously not have been used, necessitating some tracking. I think we have the ability now to leverage technology at a whole new level. Things are moving so quickly over the last 5 years. Even his broader vision for the functionality that is at, the core of tissue tracking and how that could apply in so many other ways. I mean, this is how technology advances. People start to develop a solution, and then they see it's got a broader application than maybe the root cause problem that they were originally addressing.
Yeah, Justin, it comes back to the mission. We're taking care of patients. So it's going to be implanted in a patient. It better be tracked. It better be legit. And we have recalls. We got to know where it's at. And it's really just it's doc to doc. I use that term a lot of different times. And it's basically once it's received to the patient, to the doctor's hands, you got to know where it's started, where it ended. And a lot of this is very climate controlled and living on the shelf. So we've got to make sure we follow those protocols.
All right. Well, Hayes couldn't join us today, but on behalf of Gary and myself, thanks for listening to this episode. Say it with me, Gary, of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.